So thank you very much, Science Disrupt, for inviting me to come at the end of a panel and be the academic voice in the room. I don't know, do I really mean thank you? I'm not so sure. What I'm going to do today is talk about a project that I'm working with Imperial College and the University of Newcastle, which is thinking about valuing the energy transition. And it started off with a very crude question. How much is the energy future worth? And when you ask a very crude question, you think, well, we'll be able to do some fairly crude work on it and just get some kind of stats out, and we'll maybe learn some new lessons. And 12 months later, we're still kind of crunching some of this data, but I have got some summaries for you. And in so doing, when you're talking about valuing the energy future, and we're thinking about what kind of business model innovation is necessary for utilities to continue to survive. And the reason why I say that is I've done a lot of the decentralized work, and the conclusion that I've come to is you still need some form of utility business model, albeit quite seriously adapted. We got a lot of utilities interested in the space, and we started working with the utilities. And that ended up today, so if I'm looking a little ragged, it's because I ran a decision theatre today, which is just a fancy name for a workshop, with a lot of incumbent utilities or existing energy companies at Shell Centre. And when I got off the tube this morning, I walked into Shell Centre, and there was that kind of mischievous part of my brain saying, Steve, you're thinking about saving the utility business model in the headquarters of a global oil company. And I heard, dun, 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 dun. Okay, well, this is what we're going to do. But I said, it's okay, because you're going to come here tonight and we're going to talk to an innovative crowd who's trying to disrupt the sector. So what I'm going to do to start the presentation is just tell you what I'm going to walk you through, which is the size of the future market, the business models which we think are reasonable to convert those future markets into revenues, and then think about what often gets missed is how customers feel about that. But I'm going to start with a question in who reads Terry Pratchett? Okay, fair amount of the room. But I'm going to add 20% for those who aren't admitting it. But it does take some explanation then that Vetinari is the ruler of the fictional city in the Discworld novels, and he's looking at a previously relatively unexplored region that they're all trying to exploit. And I do mean exploit, not just capture value from, but exploit. And he's saying he's looking at the blind blank map, and he felt it was very much like the future. A few things were outlined. There were some rough guesses, but everything else was waiting to be created. And very much what we're doing in this project is just looking at putting some new lines on the map. And it's riddled with false precision, as you'll see shortly. But I just want to say that we're really trying to put some lines around the future, not predicting it or models are wrong, but some are useful. And I'll start by saying that there are many different futures. And these different futures are often explained as energy scenarios. People who have had the misfortune to work in this sector for quite a while will be familiar with some of these energy scenarios across the top. But for those of you who aren't, I'm hoping this is going to work. Yeah, hooray. All of these scenarios, from National Grid's Gone Green scenarios to the Department of Energy and Climate Change, now defunct, 2050 scenarios and some academic scenarios, they're all consistent with our climate change goals, and the National Grid No Progression one is not consistent with the UK's climate change goals. And that's just, it's worth knowing, because I like to sort of say that the no progression scenario is often where we find the least new value, so it's got the least potential for people to enter the market. And so what method did we use? We stole Accenture Strategies method, basically. They did a nice report called Low Carbon, High Stakes, and it looked at the European market and said, how much is it worth? And yes, it's low carbon, but the high stakes element was how big are these markets and how can we get at them? And because we've got a few energy future, I hope everyone's all right. Because we've got a few energy futures graduates from Imperial, we did, the lady who did a lot of this work worked in, is it the bunker, Michael, you call it at Imperial, to do crunch some of the numbers on this. So it's worth just saying that not all of the numbers are mine and they've been done by somebody else to give them due credit. But what did we do? So we said there are different scenarios with different final demands, different generation mixes, and that means there are different cost inputs, we have different technical inputs, and then we have some other inputs as well, because we realized we didn't quite capture everything. But really what's important is we've got 6 new value pools in the energy transition. There may be more. If you want to throw some more at me, we'll try and integrate them into the model. But we think they are essentially these. Plant efficiency, quite simple, right? Just invest in the plant and it will become more efficient, and therefore there's value in avoiding cost. Energy service provision, which I'll unpack. Local low carbon generation, which frankly utilities have ignored to their peril, and which is scotching quite a few of their business models in the marketplace currently. Large-scale low-carbon generation that they haven't ignored, but it's pretty tough to get into. If you want to build a massive offshore wind farm, you're going to need some kind of high capitalization. Flexibility optimization, which I'm going to focus on a little bit because I think it's interesting to this audience. And carbon capture and storage, which again is largely thought of as quite big stuff. And we broke those down into avoided costs and new revenues, but the nice kind of light blue and pink are what we think the new values in the system are, and then the rest of the line is how big the market is. What you've got to appreciate is this conceals that there's quite a lot of fixed cost in the market for networks and all that kind of thing. But really what we're talking about is new values from avoided cost or new revenues, somewhere between kind of 10 to 30% of market size, which is quite big. So there's quite a lot of new stuff in a lot of these scenarios, which requires some business model innovation. And what I'm going to do is canter through the next 6 slides, which really break down those value pools, because largely they're a bit techie, and I'm feeling a bit embarrassed that my slides have now got graphs on, and people have had videos and trucks. I knew I was sunk when somebody gave trucks. That's so much cooler. But so value pool 1, plant efficiency, you would see that you would expect that the more centralized plant there is on the system, 2030, 2040, 2050, the range of values is really wide. If you end up with a very decentralized system, then there's not a lot of value available in plant efficiency for centralized stuff, whereas the high value there is set by the high nuclear scenarios, where obviously there's a lot of value in plant efficiency. But that's not particularly interesting for this audience, but energy service provision, I think, is. It's just worth noting the scales here. So we've got 1.8 billion per year of new value by 2050. But then when you go into energy services, we're looking at up to kind of 9.5 billion of new revenue from energy service provision by 2050. And you'll see that the no progression scenario, i.e. the non-climate compatible scenario, the stuff that we don't want if we want to kind of grow food to eat, shows us that there's not a lot of new revenues in there compared to the climate compatible scenarios. And how do we break that down? So really it's broken down into energy efficiency retrofit, and we're not talking about heat in this one. We will perhaps integrate heat later, but just for electrical appliances. So energy efficiency retrofit is, it's all right, it's not bad, it's in the kind of tens of millions. And then home energy management systems, so the installation of home energy management. You'll have all seen Hive control your heating from your home. Think that kind of stuff, but for electricity. But the massive driver of new values across all scenarios, this is just broken down for the national grid gone green scenario, is electric vehicle revenues. We've spoken about this, a few people have spoken about these high values available in electric vehicle revenues, but from the work that we've done, it absolutely dominates the new revenues in the system. So for those utilities or energy companies looking to innovate their business model such that it's available and gives them a business into the future, there's a massive value pool there. So the provocation that we've given, coming out of sequence, but just bear with me, is that utilities can capture so much value from the electrification of transport that they should lead the way on promoting it. It's not a prediction or what we think should happen, it's just a provocation. In value pool 3, what we've called local low carbon, this is the thing that the big utilities have largely ignored. We see that 2030, 2040, 2050, the high range of values in those scenarios have got a lot of decentralized generation. You know, if you're talking about leasing services and making sure that people can have solar panels without actually having to lay out the capital for them, it's all right saying solar's going to come down, but that's fine. But a lot of people don't want to lay out even £2,000 or £3,000, but they will lease it if there's a cost case for them. That's why people lease vehicles now rather than buy them. And we see that it's up at like 2.5 billion, so there's a lot of value in there, and it's historically been ignored by utilities. So when I was presenting this today, the kind of key in the room is, how do we get at this? When I present that this evening, how do you get at this? So we just need to think about the sizes of values in the system. And there's a few of these in the final report, which we'll be able to circulate around the network, but just to move through them, because I said that we'd do so quickly. Large-scale low carbon, big offshore wind, nuclear, large-scale solar and onshore wind. Yes, there is innovation around that. Yes, there's financial innovation. Yes, there's even some citizen energy investing in offshore wind in Denmark. But largely, our analysis says this is probably going to remain at the utility and institutional finance scale, just because it is so bloody big, and it's not really something that you would expect startups to be building, although they might be contributing to the components. So I'll skip through that one. This one is where I think it's kind of interesting for this audience. And what we're saying here is that flexibility optimization can be, if you stack these revenues together, so from battery storage, I'm going to change that now. I love that presentation on TerraLoop. It's not going to be battery storage anymore. It's going to be battery and kinetic storage and hydro. But from storage is going to be, we think in the scenario that needs the most that we analyse flexibility optimization, up to £1 billion a year from 2040, the value pool to go at. And then if you stack that alongside flexibility optimization and demand-side response, you can see that you're talking in the region of £2 billion a year in flexibility. Now, our Infrastructure Commission says it's 8, but that's kind of massively valuing everything from heat and a lot of stuff in the electric vehicle value pool. So it's about how you cut it. But it's still substantial, and getting into that market is... That's where there's a lot of stuff up for grabs. You know, we were talking about that today. And a lot of the focus, well, it was interesting, and I'll kind of conclude on there, but how utilities are viewing that value pool is very different to how we see the value pool being viewed by certainly the TerraLoop presentation and some others. And then carbon capture and storage, which to me, I mean, I know it's quite an interesting engineering challenge, but it's a retrofit onto kind of existing stuff. But what we see in there is that we're not going to do carbon capture and storage with our current carbon prices. All this graph is telling you is that if we're going to do carbon capture and storage without some form of either direct subsidy, government grant, we're going to have to whack up the carbon price fairly high to make anybody want to invest in it. And that's why we're kind of stalling a little bit in the UK at the moment. But the key slide from the value pool work is this one, which says, look, a lot of these values exist in all scenarios, but they are rescaled by scenario. Some of them are destroyed completely depending on scenario. So the local low-carbon electricity scenario value pool, which is so big in National Grid's Gone Green and RTP 1000 Flowers, and large in a couple of others as well, is destroyed completely if we kind of actually decide that we're going to go for a nuclear future, which then you would expect kind of a lot of asset stranding. And you also see the flexibility value pool is kind of bigger or smaller depending on the scenario. It's quite what you would expect. And then there's also some avoided costing flexibility as well. And my provocation there is flexibility value. Is it actually so small, or at least so volatile, that only small startups will ever bother with it, and it'll never reach the scale needed? It's just a provocation, not a prediction. So we've got new values and we need to access them. The way to access them is through some form of business model innovation. I'm sure you've all seen similar slides to this. You see kind of peer-to-peer coming into the marketplace, you see some sort of energy service company, and then you see some sort of electrification of heat and transport, which actually isn't far away from the traditional utility. You can go in pure asset-based work, or this, which is from a colleague of ours, which is basically Google runs your life. And that's the way that we present it to people. You sign over power of attorney to a company that's going to optimize your lifestyle for you. You say, I want this much green, I want this kind of mobility service, and this is the kind of business model that we think that kind of incorporates. The provocations that are on the business model innovation side, and I'm already running low on time, so I'll whiz through, are that regulation sometimes gets in the way of business models, and some business models are too risky for the levels of return in the sector. For those of you who are a politics junkie like me, any kind of talk about tariff caps should kind of frighten you a little bit, because that's not the way to promote innovation. But the final part of the puzzle that I wanted to explain was, okay, other people have done similar stuff, but what we decided to do is go to consumers and ask them what they thought they would like. Because it's all right accessing a value pool, it's all right doing some business model innovation, but then when you actually ask, does anybody want to buy this? That's when we start to get some interesting results. And I don't need you to kind of go into all this. I will say the peer-to-peer one. What we did is we went out to people and we said, we have these new business models and we think that these are the attributes that they would constitute when you're actually making a switch to a different supplier or a switch to a new way of buying electricity or energy services. So we've got peer-to-peer in there and we've seen that. And when you present peer-to-peer to existing and traditional utilities, it frightens the life out of them and they don't know how it'll work. And yet, when we present it to the public, they inherently understand it's an app that I can use on my phone. It's something that's actually relatively simple for me to grasp, even though the energy system might be terrified by it because it means a massive re-engineering of all of the institutional and some physical architecture that has been there before. People got it. When we took it to the panel providers and we went to over 2,000 people who were responsible for paying the bills. This is fairly preliminary data as well. I mean, it literally came in a couple of weeks ago, so this is our first pass at it. But peer-to-peer, which we thought might be a bit risky for people, they really kind of went for it. Not as much as the same as they've got today, but they kind of went for peer-to-peer. And equally, this kind of Google runs your life, sorry if there's anyone from Google, and we're just using, but this Google runs your life thing did not put people off. This idea that you just sign over some power of attorney did not put people off. And there's a market or a market segment that's attractive to all different types of people. None of these just polled ridiculously badly. Yeah. So the provocation from that was customers are more engaged than we think if they are given meaningful choices. At present, switching does not give them a meaningful choice. Penultimate slide, and this is a bit of a techie slide, all right, but I find it really interesting because we gave them all these different energy service companies and peer-to-peer. So what do you think? What do you think about those in terms of qualitative reactions? And their qualitative reactions to third-party control, Google runs your life, was, oh, it's a bit risky, and it's quite complicated, and it's very different from today. Things like peer-to-peer, people find it a little, okay, it's a little risky, but it's also very interesting, and it also polled as quite fair, and people found it really flexible. So I don't want to go into all of those, but people have different qualitative responses to what you're putting in front of them as a choice for the future of utilities. I'll finish with the kind of sum of the provocations, and just to say that what was really interesting today when we ran this kind of work and took people through a decision process from the present utilities was that the customer and the consumer and the user often gets lost. And I don't mean completely lost. They often speak in terms of consumer protection and the way that the system is regulated for consumer protection, but they often don't frame it as, well, what do people actually want and what do they respond well to and how can we engineer a system to service that rather than what we've already had in the past. And I think I'll just finish there because I've run out of time. But that's our research. Thanks.